Hey guys, I'm Danny West. You're back with another episode of the Soapbox, your patient education station. And we're continuing on building our muscles in clay. And if you didn't tune in last week, we chatted about the deep rotators of the hip, or our true turnout muscles. They externally rotate the thigh bone. And this is a really great system. It comes with a model, how to build the clay, and it's a company called Anatomy in Clay. So definitely check it out. It's a great way to kind of workshop or teach anatomy, especially to newbies. I teach the anatomy portion of the teacher training program here at Embody Pilates. And so we use this system, and it's basically a 10-hour course, and we go through all the muscles. And yeah, it's just a great three-dimensional way to study. So we're continuing our conversation on building, and the theme for this week, drum roll, is psoas and iliacus. So I'm really passionate about psoas and iliacus because I find that we see a lot of dysfunction in psoas in clinic, but I feel like it's because people are not strong in their core. And when they're not strong in their core, psoas is not able to do its job properly, okay? And we'll kind of explain why once we know a little bit more about it. So the iliopsoas, you might have heard in class, people complain of like, oh, iliopsoas pain, like kind of right on the front of the hips. That is actually two muscles, okay? So the first one we're gonna chat about kind of covers the inside, if you think of the pelvis like a bowl, covers the inside lip of the bowl, and this is your iliacus, okay? So it goes from the bowl of the pelvis, crosses the hip joint, and actually attaches to a little bump on the inside or medial aspect of the femur called your lesser trochanter. So last episode we chatted about how the greater trochanter, essentially fancy name for big bump on the side of the femur, that's where kind of all of our deep muscles or deep rotators of the hip kind of converge, and then they're responsible for turning out the thigh bone. But iliacus actually goes to the inside, a little smaller bump, the lesser trochanter, along with its pal psoas. So just notice how long psoas is. Like psoas, the silent P, so PSOAS, this is psoas major. It actually starts at T12, like super high, higher than you think. It is a big muscle, okay? And it goes from T12 all the way to L5, and then goes to, again, meet up with its pal on the lesser trochanter. Now, these two get married when they pass the hip. So if you think of like kind of the line of the hip being here, like where your pants would fold, let's consider that, or where your hip would crease if you go to kind of do a marching action, we'll call that like the hip joint. When they pass the hip joint, they get married and they're called iliopsoas, okay? So it's just a combination of those two names. But if we're referring to them above or proximal to the hip joint itself, they're two separate muscles, iliacus and psoas. And just to give you an idea of how long or how big psoas is, I brought in the big guns here, Mr. Bones. So, you know, hey, what's going on? So basically, psoas, if we like kind of look at it on a giant model here, T12, we count L5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then T12 is actually way up here, okay? It's where the bottom rib is, the floating rib. So that's huge, and it's a thick sucker, and so it basically starts there and then crosses down to attach on the lesser trochanter, and then iliacus would sit in through that surface, okay, on both sides. So it's a big muscle, and I like to think too, like, think if psoas is tight, or your upper back is tight, isn't it gonna muck up T-spine, or your upper back as well? So a lot of the time when people have psoas tightness, I actually give them some T-spine mobilizers to also aid that muscle because it's basically attaching on the bottom part of your upper back. So it's huge. It doesn't get enough credit. And so these two work together. These two together are your true hip flexor. Okay, so hip flexion is basically bringing the knee up into a march. Okay, so flexing the hip. It can only do one thing really well. So because psoas attaches to the spine and the thigh bone, it's like, okay, I can only do one job really well. I'm either going to be able to lift your leg, or I'm going to try to stabilize the spine. Now think of the core muscles, which again is upcoming in an episode, but basically your deep muscles, these are your core muscles. Core is not synonymous to your abdominals. Okay, so the deep core muscles, one of the 4 core muscles actually sits deep in between each vertebrae. It's called your multifidus. That's one of them, and it needs to work as a team with the other 3 players. Now, if the core isn't working properly, and its main job is to help stabilize the spine as we move a limb, if the spine is moving around its attachment site, its psoas is going to be too busy trying to hold the spine steady that it's not going to be able to flex our hip really well. And what happens then? It gets cranky. Okay, so lots of people blame the hip flexors. Oh, my hip flexors hurt. My hip flexors hurt. I got to try to lift my leg without my hip flexor. No, that's impossible. Okay, what's going on is that it's not able to work efficiently. It's saying, guys, like, I can't lift your leg. I'm working overtime here because I'm too busy trying to stabilize the spine because the core has taken a holiday. It's not kicking in. So if we stabilize and train the core muscles, okay, it gives psoas a nice stable base to work from. And then it can properly bring the thigh bone up, or essentially we call it flex the hip. But it can't do that if we're shifting and doing all these little movements of the spine. So that's where, if there's any hip issues, pretty much any issue with any extremity, it comes down to having a crap core and crap core stability. And I just find that it's, you know, again, misinterpreted. People say, oh yeah, I do core, I do like sit-ups and planks, and it's like, let's think about how we were talking about the hip. Those deep rotators can't do their job stabilizing, deep rotators of the hip, if the big ones are working overtime. Okay, so we actually need a strong framework. It's all of the deep muscles in throughout the body that we actually need to train. And the hard sell on training those is it's not kind of a feel the burn type of training. Right? When you're like working your bicep, you're like, yeah, I feel a burn. I love this. Okay? CrossFit people love to feel the burn. Okay? All the power to you. But with that said, everyone needs to be doing some sort of conditioning for your deep framework. Think of a house. Okay? If you have a garbage framework or foundation to your house, it could look really nice. It can look really good at the beach. But it's essentially going to break down at some point because that basic foundation was never built. It's the exact same with the human body. And so as physios, I find we do a lot of education on that piece. Okay, let's go back to basics. We actually need to train the core, which is a more subtle type of training. That's where the guided ultrasound in clinic is really cool, where I can show people on a screen if their core muscles are firing, and they actually are surprised because when I'm cueing them to recruit their core muscles, the different ones, it's not like an obvious contraction. It's very subtle, and so that's a hard sell for people if they don't feel like they're doing something, if they're like working it. I find they don't do it, and they're not as compliant as when they're like working their big power muscles. And I find, again, people are great in the gym working their own big power muscles, not so much knowing guidance on, okay, how do I actually work the deep muscles of the core? So that is the soapbox for today. is fight for psoas and iliacus. They need a chance, and in order for them to do their job, okay, they need to have a stable base to work from. So if there's any hip issues, even low back, any low back issues, it all comes down to working the core, making sure we have a nice, stable, strong foundation for these other muscles to move the limbs on, okay? So that is psoas and iliacus, probably my favorite set of muscles, just saying. Tune in a couple weeks and we will continue building some more muscles. We'll probably do the quads and then hamstrings and inner thighs. So lots of fun. I hope this has helped give you a three-dimensional view of the muscles. Thanks guys, have a good week.